Frontline workers keep our world moving. They work in high-stakes, fast-changing environments where technology can empower them or hold them back. And when adoption fails, the impact ripples outward, slowing teams, frustrating customers, and undermining the success of the entire organization. This is Frontline Innovators, and I'm your host, Justin Lake. In each episode, I speak with leaders who are rethinking how technology is introduced, embraced, and sustained on the front line. Leaders putting people at the heart of digital transformation. Frontline Innovators is brought to you by Skillful. We help organizations achieve lasting technology adoption for frontline teams so they can work smarter, safer, and with confidence in the tools they use every day. Okay, welcome to Frontline Innovators Podcast. I'm your host, Justin Lake, and we have another exciting guest to join us today. Today's guest is an AI strategy and organizational change leader. This global head of change management and adoption strategy for Gen AI at Altimetric focuses on driving human-centric AI adoption. With over 22 years of experience and a background working with Fortune 500 clients at Salesforce, she brings a practical perspective on helping frontline and operations leaders turn AI into real business value. Please welcome Wendy Vestevich. Hello, Wendy. How are you?
Thank you, Justin. Thank you for having me.
I'm so glad you're here. I'm so glad we're going to get to have this conversation today. And I want to dig in right out of the gate and ask you, in fact, your intro kind of leads to this topic that I want to talk about, which is, what do you see as the biggest operational consequence of not getting adoption on the front lines with new technology deployments and any other change, quite frankly?
Mm-hmm. Well, if I could go a little bit broader than operational, I could take the easy way out and say dollars, leaving money on the table, et cetera, not realizing an investment. But I think what comes to mind immediately is reputation. And when a rollout, for example, or the start of a program that your company has put, sometimes tens of millions of dollars behind, and it has convinced the value to all of the leaders who are signing off on it. And then it trickles down to the folks who are using it day to day, who depend on it for very detailed tasks, and it's fumbled. Then not only does leadership have a reputational hit, but that's going to eventually trickle down to that organization's customers. There's going to be a perception problem of things not working smoothly with from the customer perspective and internally. And unfortunately for the folks who interface directly with customers, they're going to be suffering the consequences of the reputation of the company and that process not working out. So it is sort of like a bigger, broader answer to your question. We could get into all the operational nitty gritty, but to me that's the one thing that I hear the most.
I think that's actually really interesting. And you threw me a bit of a curveball. When you first said that, my head immediately went to external reputation.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's part of what you're saying. That the part that wasn't immediately obvious to me was the internal reputation aspect as well. Now, let's talk about that a little bit further. Is there an example you can share that kind of speaks to how that reputation could impact things internally?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I can start going back in my previous life with, pretty traditional, CRM rollout and or something along those lines, where one of the questions, because readiness and understanding where the project owners are at in their maturity of like, let's make changes, right? When we're talking about a broader change management perspective. I like to ask what has gone in previous programs and previous, changes that your organization has made. What has gone wrong, and what were the consequences of that? That's always a regular part of my assessment, and you get so much information from those lessons learned because now the folks you're dealing with on the and I'm in the consulting space, obviously, so that my stakeholders that I'm working with, they don't want to suffer that pain again. They're happy to unburden themselves of the failures, quote unquote, of the past, because they don't want to be viewed as inept leaders. They don't want to be viewed as championing a failing program. So they're happy to, spill the tea essentially on what happened before and avoiding all of that into this next iteration of whatever it is they're trying to implement. So, and now if I can speak about the AI space that I'm in, um, you're also dealing with the reputation of these AI models, like the whole um, the hallucination aspect of it, the not being reliable in returning information that I'm querying that is accurate and factual, et cetera. So that is something that needs to also be considered because if you're telling your organization, your company, we're going to roll out OpenAI, we're going to we're going to give it to you, we're going to give it to marketing, we're going to allow you guys to use it in whatever way you want, and you have, you know, somebody saying, "Well, I used it for a recipe and it totally gave me garbage," then you as an organization have to acknowledge, okay, there are some things that could go wrong. This is not something that is foolproof. And I don't want to, call out OpenAI specifically, but any type of technology, there's going to be points of failure. What you must consider the human aspect of receiving that technology and the skepticism and the things like that. So,
And I think it's real. I mean, it's real and it's a legitimate concern. I was looking at a vendor's website just yesterday, and I noticed what I thought to be a very interesting statement. They said 95% no hallucinations with the responses that we give back to your employees.
mhm,
And I thought that was an interesting call out because I'm like, okay, that sounds like a great stat, but how do you deal with the 5%? Like you're talking about global scaled organizations here. That 5% could be hundreds or thousands of transactions that do have hallucinations, right? That 5%
mhm,
actually can represent a significant amount. So I thought it was
yes,
interesting. I appreciated their transparency in an attempt to be honest about where the technology was. But then I also thought about it as, well, if that was my company and I was going to go send 100 people out to go use this, knowing that 5% of them, five of them, might be getting information that was completely fabricated. How do we deal with that? So I thought about the question yesterday. Now I have you as an expert on the line. How do we deal with that kind of change? How do we talk to those users and acknowledge that with transparency, but also prevent them from the potential impact,
mhm.
from experiencing the impact?
Yeah, yeah. So this is where, and I'm sure we're gonna dig into this more in our conversation, but to really understand the perspective of all levels of the company who are going to be touching this piece of technology. So leaders obviously have a have an interface with the tool, and then you have like the frontline folks or the day to day, the middle of the organization and lower tiers of the organization to be able to communicate to them that you're the thought leader. This is your thought partner. Any piece of technology is your thought partner. You as the thought leader should feel empowered to discern, is this factual? Is this valuable? Is this going to, is this wrong essentially or right? To acknowledge the gut check essentially. And in the AI space, it's called human in the loop, right? So, which is why being able to get, like do ride-alongs and get to know like essentially the personality at the different levels of a team, and the way that the managerial culture at the team for at the company, for example, um, culture is a huge part of it. To speak and say, okay, you're the steward of this. It doesn't matter if you're vice president or individual contributor, whatever. We want to equip you with enough knowledge and enough confidence to be able to discern, what's right, what's accurate, essentially.
Yeah. How do you think this is different between a senior level stakeholder who might be using the same technology, albeit in a different way, but they may, I'm just going to use OpenAI. We're not picking on them, but we'll just use this as example, right? So they may be using ChatGPT for their
Mhm.
function as an executive in the organization and having it crunch some data or do some copywriting and things like that. And those all, to your exact point, there is some discernment that we have to apply, some judgment that we have to apply to the data, the information that we get back from that. But our team members on the front lines have a very different experience. It is by nature more transactional in their role.
Mm-hmm.
And so they are tending to deal less with big picture information and a little bit more with ground level transactional information.
Mm-hmm.
And they probably have less experience to
Mm-hmm.
apply judgment. So, how do you think about those two different scenarios and how can we treat them better so that we know we're getting the best outcomes in both of those scenarios?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's understanding the purview of the leader versus the individual contributor or frontline. Um, the purview of the leader is that they have to communicate up, to board, to their board. They have to communicate out and down. And they need to have a broader understanding of the impact and the scalability of, say, ChatGPT and understand, maybe not have like a deep technical understanding, but to but to understand the application and the best application of that platform. And then in order to make it work for frontline folks, to understand that their purview is not so big. They have probably more of a narrow and deep um, responsibility. So it is up to, say, the consultant or the digital services provider in my world to be able to like train them to understand, okay, the impact is going to be directly on your job performance. You're going to be measured, you're going to be evaluated. There's going to be customers evaluating you via CSAT, et cetera. And this tool should be able to help you with that and to ensure that feedback and obviously, the successful adoption or not successful adoption is filtered back up to the top levels of the company. So yeah, I think I kind of veered off a little bit on on that, but
No, but you opened up another question, which is adoption. That's near and dear to us in my day job.
mhm,
And I am actually curious. We're studying this internally in our own company as well. And we're a relatively tiny organization compared to those that we serve, but we are focused on technology adoption as a company.
mhm,
That's what we help companies deliver. And yet we also find ourselves with some questions. How do we evaluate the adoption of AI? If you were to
mhm,
ask anybody on my team, everyone would say, yes, I use AI. Okay. So
mhm,
box checked, right? But that's not really the full story. We have vastly different levels of actual engagement with different AI tools. And so some of them have just made ChatGPT or Claude a replacement for Google, right? And just a very simple, question response kind of scenario. And others in the organization, I mean, my entire dev team is using Claude Code and going deep, right?
mhm,
So we have opposite extremes. So when you think about adoption, and I'd be curious if we can to keep parsing out these two different sets of stakeholders. I know I'm kind of bringing things up at the polar extremes, but I think, senior level leadership, what's adoption look like for them and how is that measured? And then frontline team members, same question. What's adoption look like and how would that be measured for them?
mhm. Yeah, I think I might have distracted myself internally by immediately jumping to, job elimination, um, as a hurdle to adoption for AI.
Yes. You mean the
But I can
potential for job? Is that what you're saying?
y yes, yes,
Okay.
and I think if I can just be specific in the developer space, um, these are, and this is also knowing the personality of the group that you're dealing with. Developers are they're academic, they're super smart, they love working and engineering on things. And um, if you have a group with a personality of software engineers, they might be resisting, like, well, I'm not showing my work. I This thing is making it too easy for me. They've been used to slogging through code over the decades, maybe, and now they are being massively assisted by this tool, which is like, okay, I guess I don't need to do that math in my head anymore. I guess I don't need to have that language, right? This is just feeding it to me. So, where am I being valuable in this loop, right? Um, Sorry, can you recap your question? I think I just
Yeah,
I kind of
no.
jumped ahead.
Well, you're
Yeah.
yeah, I have like 5 more now based on what you just said.
Okay.
So we're gonna have to like really
I'm going to need to take better notes during our call here. So my initial question was really thinking about the difference of adoption between
Hmm.
the two sets of stakeholders, how we think about what adoption means and how we would measure that. So the two examples I'm saying, how might we look at executive stakeholders and how would we think about adoption and how would we measure it for them versus frontline workers in the organization who may also be using AI, but they may be using it in a more transactional context. And so what would we consider good adoption for them and how would we measure that? So that was my first question. And then I have others now
Okay.
that I want to come back to also.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much for bringing me back.
Yeah, let's go.
So we deal with this question a lot because I think the cultural mindset around AI is every company wants to be AI first. They say, quote unquote, AI first. So, as and in my work now, as we get under the covers a little bit for what that means to be AI first, there's many layers to this. So, AI first for marketing means we have smart outreach, we have real-time data, we can make decisions lightning fast and be able to tailor our message quickly, like massively, you know, faster than before. For different for so if we're talking about senior leadership in um let's say sales, we we have sales and service. So we've got smart bots that are triaging. We've got um that so like what does the identity of the company um mean, or how do you tailor the identity of the company to be AI first? So what
Hmm.
is your product and service? How does AI fit into and boost your service or your product, or the customer service aspect of it? If you're talking about, a broader, like more like a bigger services company, or like a Cisco, for example, you've got a big team of developers, and when you say, we want our engineering team to be AI first, well, they kind of have to make that decision because they're the experts. They have to say, okay, well, it's okay. We promote the use of these tools. It's not a cheat. This is something that's going to help us outpace our competition. So I think there's many layers to understanding what adoption is, depending on where it is you want to win. Um, I think that's for the leadership part of it. And then for frontline folks, now if we talk about, I just so I can ground our definition of frontline, I'm thinking of field service folks. I'm thinking of salespeople who are going store to store, for example,
Yep. Same here.
um
We're
okay,
on,
okay.
we're in alignment on the definition. Yep.
Okay. So for them, I think being able to rely upon and um, show any sort of boost in metrics, and that can be qualitative metrics as well. Like, I feel, yeah, I love my job. I love that I have this AI assistant with me that will record my verbal conversations with a convenience store owner as I'm dropping off, their tobacco order, or their and I don't have to worry that I'm missing something from that conversation. And how can the company then turn those insights into, new goals, new product offerings, et cetera. So I think that's, for me, that's how the two layers kind of speak to adoption.
Yeah, I think actually one of the great takeaways from what you just said, I think, is thinking about the incentives for each of those employees as it stands today and how
Hmm.
or if those incentives will be changed, be measured differently. But at the end of the day, if it's a field service technician, delivery driver, a senior sales person or executive in the organization, whatever they're being measured by, if we can connect their use of AI to improved outcomes, then that
Hmm.
should really ultimately be the adoption metric, right?
Yes.
It's not about, did you use the tool 50 times today? Like, who
Hmm.
cares if you used it twice but you doubled your sales numbers, or if you used it
Hmm.
twice but your CSAT scores went up by 20%, and that's a metric that's important, then that's all that really matters, I guess, right?
Yeah.
And really thinking of it in terms of the incentives and what would motivate somebody to want to engage.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. I mean, and then you can go back to the old tried and true, like we're sunsetting old technology. You can't work around it anymore. You have to use
Right.
this. So that is
Right.
kind of like the stick and the carrot versus the stick
Yeah.
approach, but
Yeah. For
so.
sure. Well, one other thing that you said made me think about a conversation that's fresh on my mind because I just came out of a 2-day leadership planning meeting and we were talking about the way that software developers are feeling about AI. And so we are heavily using it today, as I mentioned before. And our developers have begun to come to that realization that what they once knew of with this job, even some of the things that they cherished and were most proud of about their role, is changing, right? And
Mhm.
some of those things may be going away and gone forever. The idea of having a developer bang out code on a keyboard is probably not coming back, right?
Mhm.
And so in our company, you know, AI tools are writing the first draft of every code. In fact, AI is actually writing the user stories before it even goes into development, right? So like we've actually begun to not begun. We are in a fairly mature phase of really leveraging these tools across the entire process. The role for them is changing because they no longer get the same pride from authoring, an amazing, package of code that they might have been, wanting to share with the other team and their buddies in the past. Their role is actually shifted into managing agents now.
Mhm.
And that is a very different role than what some of them signed up for. The interesting thing that came up in our conversations internally yesterday is we talked about how this is, we were kind of acting as if this was unique to software developers. And then we had this epiphany moment where we said, this is exactly the same thing that our customers with field service technicians deal with. Because field service technicians, believe it or not, and software developers actually have a lot of similarities in that they pride themselves in their knowledge about that role. Right. And so, field service engineers don't always necessarily want to admit that they needed or used a bot to get help on
Mhm.
something because that knowledge that they have is part of their value to the organization. And so now relinquishing some of that value prop to a piece of technology creates a very vulnerable feeling for them, right?
Mhm.
Have you
Yeah.
experienced this in any of your work around AI today with people being anxious about their role and their significance being reduced as a result of that?
Yes, yes. This conversation comes up often.
I would imagine.
It may not come up with the leaders that I speak to initially as we are embarking on the engagement that we're going to be working on them with them. But it does reveal itself when you start getting into the meat of the day-to-day. And, what I have seen with the major model providers now, and I am, working with Anthropic in my role at Altimetric. I'm the partnership leader for, Altimetric and Anthropic. And what I'm seeing the narrative, um, from these model providers change from replacement to uplift, to we are the rocket ship, get on it, we're gonna take you to the moon. And that in the proof of showing how easy things can be now it's being reframed, and you're able to show value more in the outcome. Like, I was able to do as a field service technician, and I had to go through a PDF manual, and I'm sitting up in the cherry picker or whatever. Now, that 2 hours that that technician is sitting up in the cherry picker, in the old way, I don't wanna say the old way of thinking because 'cause we're still working our way out of that thinking, but
Yeah.
it is like, "Oh, this person's working really hard. This person is spending a lot of time. They're probably billing hourly to whomever, but that work, that 2-hour block of time is justified." Now, if that person can fire up their phone, speak into it, and say and take a picture and say, "Okay, this is what I'm dealing with," and then it gives them this instantly, then they can be done in a third of the time. And yes, the perception might be, "Oh, this guy didn't do anything. He was just working for 30 minutes and now he's done." But if the outcome, if we start seeing that these outcomes are happening faster and the work is better and the workers are able to move quickly from job to job, their performance improves. So it is it's a cognitive dissonance moment, I think, for everybody now. Is like, is this a replacement or is this a boost? I personally believe it's a massive boost. I love it. I love being on the rocket ship, but I can, in my day to day and in the ways that I work with the customers that I work with, you do have to be a little bit of a therapist and say, look, I know you've been the silo of not the silo, but yeah, I guess the silo of information, and everybody, you're the go-to person, but you're going to have to relinquish that in the um it's just the way that things are moving forward. So you can accept it, then, we like to be hand holders in change management, but at some point it's like, hey, this is the way that we're all going. So,
If there's one thing I've learned in the business I'm in at Skillful
yeah.
and from the podcast of having interviewed about 100 change management folks, um, we humans are not very good at change in the short term. I do think that we are in the long term. When you look back in history and you think of the Industrial Revolution, 100 years ago and some of the things that were coming about in a relatively short amount of time in human history, we have come very, very, very far since the early 1900s, right? That is profound. It's hard to imagine. In the short term, it just feels very painful to make that change. And I think this is what we've learned a lot in our business about technology adoption is the biggest barrier to overcome is not necessarily just educating people about how the workflows have changed and things like that, where that buttons have changed or drop downs, or now you need to scan a barcode instead of entering text manually. Like, yeah, those things are also important. But the far bigger thing is that your job has now changed. That process has changed. The way that you communicate with your customers changed. And all of those things seem to just create like such a massive knot in people's chest. And it's understandable. But that's again, I know I'm preaching to the choir here as a change management professional, but those are the things that are actually bigger than the tech. I think AI is probably not probably, it is the most profound change that we've experienced that involves technology and humans together. And, going back to our developers, going back to field service
Hmm.
technicians, it is a fundamental shift in how we perceive them as valuable. And so as
Hmm.
I think about the change, as I'm thinking about this, I probably should be having more conversations with my developers to say, I no longer value you for crafting a line of code. That's not what I'm
Yes.
looking for. I actually value you by stepping up and being able to manage 3 agents that are writing that code for you. And it's,
Yes.
or whatever the measurement is, but it's a real different way of thinking for all of us, for the people
Hmm.
that are doing the work and for those of us that are evaluating them and doing their performance reviews. We all need to change and accept that, we're not going back.
Yeah, yeah, and that's you're um dealing, like, not dealing with, but what you're talking about in your company is happening, like, all over across the board. And and one of the things that you just said that triggered something, and it just flew out of my head. But oh, to be able to reframe, um, particularly around time as an investment and time as the um we like to think that the more time it takes, the better the outcome. Well, now, and I'm still wrapping my brain around this as well, is what does outcome we need to talk about outcomes as opposed to the process of getting there. I
Yes.
think I think now, yes, there are still steps, there are still processes, there's still things that must be done that are manual or analog, but now with the presence of AI being across the board in people's personal lives and in work lives, it's no longer about how hard I'm working to deliver this value. It's how quickly can I understand and leverage AI to get me to the outcome. And like, even in the consulting space, we're dealing with this now because how do we charge? We charge by time and materials. So
Yes.
now, how can we justify a $50,000 engagement that used to take 3 months, now takes 1 month? But we still want to charge the same amount of money, right? So we have to be able to say, we are so good at using this tool that we're going to teach you how to use it, but you're going to pay us for our expertise even though it's going to take a third of the time that you would expect it to take. It's not cheaper. It's not cheap, fast work. It's the same work, but boosted.
Well,
So
let's
yeah,
let's
yeah.
talk about some of the downsides. The phrase that exists today that didn't exist 12 or 24 months ago is AI slop. And I think
Mm,
one of the things that is a downside of these tools and the way that some humans might use them is you can do a simple prompt. You can take a couple seconds or a couple minutes or a couple hours to, kind of craft your prompt and your request. But taking that first response and then submitting that as your work has some dangers associated with it. Right.
mhm,
And
mhm,
so to your point, it's not just the work output. Sure, the first pass of work output may be better and faster, but if there are some hallucinations in there, if the things that just got a little bit, off a couple of degrees, by the time you've iterated on that thing a few times, it may be 180 degrees
mhm.
off of what you were trying to present. So
Yeah.
I actually think the role of humans now, again, as we've said, it's changing a lot, but I think now it's one of oversight, your editorial role, since you didn't necessarily craft that copy yourself. Now your
Mhm.
role shifts from being a creator into being a curator or editor, and it has
Yes.
a different set of responsibilities on it.
I like that term curator. I've been repeating ad nauseum thought leader, thought partner, but I
Yeah,
think I think curator actually is a really really great way to convey the leadership that people need to take with a tool as powerful as Gen AI.
yeah. So with with our thoughts, obviously, with a show called Frontline Innovators, we're hyper focused on the people that are on the front lines working with customers and things like that. And I'd like to just explore that a little bit more with you. I believe that your consulting practice today, I don't think you're spending as much time there, if I recall correctly, as you had been in a past life. Am I remembering that right?
With
With
the in
with
consulting.
Frontline, yeah, with Frontline,
Oh,
you're not doing as much in your consulting role with Frontline projects
correct.
today. Is that true? Okay.
Yeah, yeah. A few years ago, I was. Yes.
Yeah. And so I'm just curious, and maybe a few years ago, maybe it's, a few years ago now is like an eternity ago as it relates to AI. So maybe these things weren't relevant then. But because I spend so much of my time supporting companies with a large frontline workforce, I am really trying to evaluate the impact that it is and will continue to have on them. And I think what I've seen, I actually went to SAP Sapphire last year. I went to ServiceNow's Knowledge 25 conference. So I really wanted to put myself in the room with some of the biggest software vendors and the integration partners. I didn't make it to Dreamforce, unfortunately. My favorite band played there, so that was a miss too.
Oh boy.
Um, so, but one thing I heard that I thought was really interesting is that most of the application of AI was really centered around the knowledge workers.
Mhm.
And and so it leaves this open question for me about what the impact is going to be in the field.
Mhm.
And I think some of this has changed. Like those two conferences I just mentioned were about 9 months ago. And so a lot
Mhm.
has changed in 9 months.
Yeah.
That seems crazy. And so if I were to go to those same two conferences in 26, I might hear a slightly different story. But like I literally went to go talk to the product teams at both of those companies to see how AI was affecting their front lines. And every time what they did was they would drag me over to a desktop and show me their dispatching tool, their scheduling tool, and how they were using AI to enhance scheduling and stuff like that. And I said, that's not the question I'm asking. That's how
Mhm.
your scheduler is going to change with AI. That's how your
Mhm.
dispatcher, like the people, the routers, those people in the back office that are doing their job, I understand that part. What I'm asking is, how's it going to change the guy in the field who is doing that delivery, working on that elevator motor, whatever the case may be? And I still am not seeing a ton get pushed down to the field. I'm curious
Mhm.
in your current or recent former role if you have any insights on how it is or how you anticipate that it will be affecting their roles.
Yeah, so, in my time with Salesforce, we did a lot of field service work, obviously,
Yeah.
and, what the beauty of Salesforce is that it is a highly packaged, well understood technology service. So, the way that it is communicated to, like, this is how it's going to be of value to your field service group, is pretty straightforward, right? It addresses pain points. It's well understood. It's got industry standards already built into it. It's designed for day-to-day field service work, considering mobile connectivity, small devices, not laptops, maybe a lot of tablet work, et cetera. So all of that was already considered in the product itself, right? So it was a lot easier, I think, to have a successful replacement um, or upgrade to whatever technology the field service group was using. Um, because Salesforce, what they would do is they would then take that feedback from their biggest customers and then rebuild it back into the platform. So it was a really successful model of having a specific product tailored for a specific set of tasks, right? Out in the specifics around being out in the field. Now, when you have something that is as broad and powerful as Gen AI or any of these models that are out there now, you need to understand that you need to actually create the guardrails for this tool, because it's like you can do anything with it. And
Right.
and the people who to leaders who are saying, okay, we're getting pressure from our board, we need to do something with AI with our you know cable techs that come and visit our customers in their homes. How do we wrap our brains around, first of all, what's going to be the MVP? Second of all, like, how are we going to chunk this out? We need to be really tight on our guardrails around what functionality this is providing. We need to go through the whole socialization of, like, this is valuable, this is something that's going to help you. But I think that the possibilities are so big that it's almost harder to tailor it down specifically to a field service context, right?
Yes. Yeah, I agree with that. I actually think what we've seen is some of these initiatives are not succeeding in field service. And it's my belief that some of those organizations have maybe bit off more than they can chew. And so they have had some adoption challenges. I think they've also had some technical challenges. It's easy for companies to come in, us technology vendors that are coming into large organizations and saying, hey, we have integrations into this system, and this system, right? Obviously, to enable a lot of these capabilities requires some integrations. The reality is most of these large companies have, decades of overlapping systems. And you ask
Hmm.
them, do you use SAP or Oracle or Salesforce? And they say yes, right? They're using all of the above, right? They're not just using
Uh-huh.
one of those systems. And many companies have multiple instances of SAP because they acquired 3 companies over the last decade and they were all,
Oh boy.
so that's just the reality of these systems. And so it's like, well, it depends on which region you're in, which instance of SAP we're hitting. Like, so all these
Hmm.
things sound really easy at the demo stage. But
Yeah.
then when you actually get into full blown implementation, I mean, again, I'm preaching to the choir here. This is the world that you guys are living in. But I think
Hmm.
the idea of breaking things down into smaller chunks and getting down to a single use case, perhaps in a given region, so that we can scale back to enable the humans to adapt, but
Hmm.
also to make the integrations realistic and practical, will set us on a better trajectory.
Yeah, yeah, and like, I'll go back to my original, like, my DNA and my professional career is user experience, and
Hmm.
I know that a lot of UX professionals in this age of AI are struggling with, where is this role? There's no need, like, really, we're 2 years away maybe from not having to do wireframes anymore,
Yeah.
because it's going to be an agentic only interface. But this is where the evolution and the importance of user experience in this, understanding the context in which you're trying to roll out this technology, this Gen AI or this AI technology, to be able to, to funnel down the possibilities to something that is going to be really valuable. And in field service context, you still have the world is not going to go away. You're going to have noise, you're going to have mobility problems, you're going to have, annoying conversations and whatever is going to
Yeah.
be impacting this person from moving from A to Z. And that UX perspective is still really valuable, even though you're only looking at an agent or, like a chat bot on your screen. So it's in order to be able to uh, cohesively explain this is why we're moving from this tool that you loved for the last 5 years to this new tool, which looks totally different and is going to be, helping you in ways that maybe you didn't think you needed help, basically. Yeah. So I don't know.
It's
It's a wild
fascinating.
west. Yeah.
The thing you just said too is about having, kind of an agentic user experience for people on the front lines. I'm very curious to see how that evolves. We obviously have a dev team and designers on our team, and we're thinking about these things for the technologies that we build. And then also we work adjacent to a lot of the big enterprise systems creators, Salesforce and others. And so I'm just very curious to see how this evolves. I've seen some demonstrations
Yeah.
from other companies that are very chat centric, and I understand the draw for that. I've also done a lot of ride alongs with field service technicians and delivery drivers, and I don't think that a chat interface is always ideal for the real
Mhm.
world, right? I think there are certain applications where chat interface is an absolute godsend. It's amazing. And there are others when I think actually having a list view, an old fashioned list view with checkboxes, is actually incredibly helpful.
Mhm.
And so
Yeah.
I think sometimes just because we can do something in the world of UX doesn't mean that we necessarily should. And this is an example where more than ever, we need to bring our users into that conversation about the design. So even though you're saying, and I agree with your bigger point, UX designers may not be needed in the same way, but that discovery with humans, I think is actually going to get more important in an era of, traditional app development. We could probably get 80, 90, 95% of the design right before we got a ton of feedback from users, just because there
Mhm.
were, design patterns that we could draw from. I think
Mhm.
that time has changed now. And I think we need to go back to basics of sitting those folks down and saying, here are a couple of alternatives. How would you like to see that happen? And then, even though we actually let an agent build that dynamically on the fly, we still need to instruct that agent on, what those user preferences are.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah, and I think about, to the years past when when I would sit in a call center and I would be plugged in with the headset to listen to the conversations that a call center agent would be having, and I remember being struck with, um, how much these folks like their jobs. They, yeah, it's a grind. You're sitting in fluorescent lights all day long and there's noise around you, but they really loved solving problems for the people that they had on the phone. And I would love to go back to those people and say, okay, so how has do you miss that interaction? Because now there's a bot that maybe routes those types of calls away from you now that you no longer have to solve, or they've self-serviced themselves out of these problems that you enjoyed solving. So yeah, I would really like to hear like from the horse's mouth what that impact has been over the
Yeah.
years.
One of our customers got a pretty big call center operation around the world. And one of the things, an interesting point that they made to me is with the advent of AI taking over some of those workloads, when we are calling into a customer service center, some portion of our calls are being handled through automation, obviously, and that's going to continue to increase. The role of the humans that will remain will actually be to deal with the stickiest of situations, right? Those that are least able to be automated through AI, right?
Mhm.
So that, it's going to continue to move deeper and deeper into complexity. But at the end of the day, there's always going to be some number of humans remaining that just need to deal with those exception scenarios. And those will be, by definition, the most complex, hairy situations, right?
Yeah.
So there will probably be fewer of them. I do think that's a role that's going to be, pretty greatly impacted. But the people that remain in that profession are still going to have an important job to do, right? And in fact,
Mhm.
it may become actually more important because they're going to be picking up after, I guess we should just say, after the bots fail to deliver, they're going to be left picking up the slack there for a bit.
Huh. Yeah, and even from the customer standpoint, like I remember this conversation really stuck with me over the years. It was probably like 6 or 7 years ago, and I was in a credit card, call center, and this woman called in. Her husband had recently passed away, and she was, the agent that I was listening in with was so caring, was so gentle with this widow that at the end of the call, not only did the agent get through and solve the issues, but the customer, the woman calling was like thanking her, like, "Thank you so much for helping me through this. Thank you for being so sympathetic and understanding that I didn't have things that I needed, I need papers that I don't have." And I think that is something to consider, that can't be replaced by a bot. Like those, but how do you determine, how now in this day and age, how does that call, that sensitive call, get routed to a human? And obviously there are ways to do that with, design and whatever, but I often think about that um, experience.
Well, and I think, that kind of reinforces the point that the humans will be left to do those things that humans can do best. Right. And that
Mhm.
scenario, I think, is the perfect example of that. And so I think for those of us that are making decisions about how to apply resources, and for those that are thinking about, hey, is AI going to, replace my job? I think for all of us, we need to continue to stay close to the human element and make
Mhm.
sure that, we're really keeping that thought process front and center to make sure that we are thinking of not just human in the loop from like a process governance standpoint, but like human in the loop because we're humans serving other humans, and we want to make sure that we're, adding value where we can.
Totally, totally. Yeah.
So we've come to the end of our time. I am curious to maybe get one more question in here. I'd love to see what advice you would offer. You're obviously steeped in transformational projects involving AI. What is there one piece of advice that you would offer our listeners about what to look out for or what to do in terms
Mhm.
of thinking of improving adoption of AI?
I would uh I would really take a pause and spend some time thinking about what successful adoption means, and to challenge the straightforward, let's measure engagement via a login and use and ways of using the tool, to um, to really understand the culture of the company that you're working with, to understand the way that leadership thinks and all of the pressures that leadership is experiencing, as well as how leadership communicates the pressures of the downstream organization, and to challenge it. Because when you only speak to leaders, you often get okay, I'm speaking for myself. You often get a rosy colored picture of everybody's enthusiastic. Oh, we are so fired up. We're ready to go. But then you really need to take the time to understand, who this is impacting, their feelings around it, and to be able to gently communicate that back as something that needs to be focused on in the project, basically in the work. So I would say culture, um, challenging rosy colored glasses outlook, and doing some boots on the ground work.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I think I'm going to add to just an insight I'm taking away from today is to think about the incentives for the people that are using AI today, and um, are their current incentives the right ones for the future? Are we are we looking for the wrong things in an era of AI where maybe it was output driven before in a particular way, and now we maybe need to rethink how those incentives should be positioned to account for the fact that AI may be doing some of the work that they did before. I can tell you at our company, we have no aspirations to see any of those people go, but I do want to see their jobs evolve so that
Mhm.
we can achieve bigger and better things with the same team that we have now. And it does really
Mhm.
make me think about those incentives. So I appreciate us having
Yeah.
that conversation at the top of this today. It was really insightful. Thank you
Thank you.
for
I
joining
learned
us
a
today.
lot from you too, in the journey you're taking with your company. So I
Yeah.
appreciate that.
Well, and we talk about this a lot. Your company is bigger than ours. Most of the companies we serve are big companies. And what's really interesting is if we're having challenges with this, we have 18 people on our team. So it's a fairly it's a very small organization. But when we see these things creep into our organization, I say, oh my gosh, what if I had 5,000 people, right? And the leaders that we serve have 5,000 people or 10,000 people or sometimes bigger organizations than that. So it's just, I don't think I've ever experienced a period in my life where we've been learning at such a compressed state. There's so
Yeah.
much to learn, and it's exciting. Fortunately, I enjoy learning, and I'm very
Yeah,
curious, and I want to continue to advance on this, but I think we all have a lot to learn from each other. So Wendy, I appreciate you carving out
totally.
some time and sharing your insights with us today.
Thank you so much, Justin. It was a pleasure.
This is really good.
Thanks for listening to Frontline Innovators. If you enjoyed today's conversation, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And remember, when we put people at the center of digital transformation, frontline workers thrive and organizations succeed. This podcast is brought to you by Skillful, helping frontline teams adopt the technology they need to work smarter, safer, and with confidence.